Greetings from the C.M. Russell Museum and welcome to the March 2021 Educational Symposium. As we did in 2020, we're delivering this educational symposium virtually. Well, that's a change from how many of you are accustomed to engaging in our annual symposium. This year's topic is an exceptional treat, a landmark in the vast literature that covers the life of Charles M. Russell, and this one through the words of his beloved Nancy. The title of this personal and dynamic book, Backtracking in Memory, The Life of Charles M. Russell, Artist. Joining us to discuss are the leaders behind this exciting project, Tom Petrie and Brian Dippie. No two finer, passionate friends of Charlie in today's age are more fit for this phenomenal work than Tom and Brian. Also, as a co-moderator of this discussion, I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague, Brenda Cornick, the Chief Collections and Exhibitions Officer here at the C.M. Russell Museum. Brian, Tom, and Brenda, welcome. It's important for you all, the visitors, to know that all education programming at the C.M. Russell Museum is underwritten by our year-round education sponsor, D.A. Davidson. We thank D.A. Davidson for their partnership, support, and commitment to helping us advance the art and soul of the American West. For many of you, Brian and Tom are two gentlemen who certainly need no introduction. Nonetheless, please allow me to formally welcome them to this program. Tom Petrie is an avid collector of Russell work and a passionate champion of Western art. Tom helped establish the Petrie Institute of Western American Art at the Denver Art Museum and has supported the publication of many works on Russell, to include Charles M. Russell, a catalog raisonné in 2007, the Masterworks of Charles M. Russell, a retrospective of paintings and sculpture in 2009. Tom is the immediate past chair of the C.M. Russell Museum Board of Directors and is presently the co-chair of the museum's Art and Soul campaign. Brian is a professor emeritus at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, where he's taught U.S. history from 1970 until his retirement in 2009. A specialist in the history of Western American art, he has focused his work on George Catlin, Frederick Remington, and especially that of his boyhood idol, Charles M. Russell, on whom Brian has published scores of books and essays. Brian, who first visited the C.M. Russell Museum in 1954, received the museum's Russell Western Heritage Award 60 years later in 2014. Most recently, Brian and Tom have collaborated on Charles M. Russell, The Women in His Life and Art in 2018, and Return to Calgary, Charles M. Russell and the 1919 Victory Stampede in 2019. Tom and Brian, it's a pleasure to have you for the 2021 Educational Symposium, but more importantly, it's an honor to have this treasure of a book enter the landscape of Russell. Thank you both for your energy and vision on this project. And now let me hand it off to my co-moderator, Brenda Cornick. Brenda?
Well, hello and welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here, such an exciting project. My first question is for Brian, and that is, do you know when Nancy began writing the manuscript and in what form it was in when she passed away?
The manuscript in question is has an interesting history. Nancy Russell had been working with Charlie and a publisher on a collection of his short stories right till the time of his death. And then she saw it through to publication in 1927. Along the way, she got the idea through the publisher that possibly a biography would be desirable that had an ability to showcase his art as well as to tell his story. And Nancy, as a consequence, hired a biographer, a Great Falls journalist, who spent the summer of 1927 in a cabin at Lake McDonald, where Nancy was located, right beside Bullhead Lodge. He came with his family, wrote his book, and it was finished by October 1927 and submitted to the publisher. The publisher turned it down at once as overwritten and purple prose and full of hot air, and not the kind of book that they were looking for. Now, Nancy had a stake in that book. She put it aside and immediately turned to drafting her own book. And we know that she spent much of 1928 So a year and a half after Charlie died, or a year and a little less, working on a biography. She was accumulating material for all the years of Russell's life that preceded her first meeting with him when he was a 31-year-old struggling artist in Cascade, Montana in 1895. So she talked to family, she interviewed family, she contacted old friends who knew him in his range days and put that material together in a number of sheets of manuscript that were sometimes typed for her, that were in longhand in a book that was partly in shorthand. She was making notes towards her book, her biography of Charles M. Russell, when the publisher introduced her to a different project. How about a book of Charles M. Russell's letters, his illustrated letters? Nancy turned to that project by 1928, after she, in effect, was overlapping her book, her biography, worked on it through 1929 and got it to the publisher by the end of that year. Good Medicine, Charles M. Russell's collected letters. That distracted her from her own book. And as a consequence, she set aside the manuscript she'd been working on, but she never forgot it entirely. Good Medicine, following trails plowed under his stories, was a huge success. And I think in the 1930s, Nancy found little encouragement for a biography because, of course, the country was in the Great Depression. And indeed, prices in Western art were tumbling like everything else. And Nancy had more practical concerns as she saw it. She never abandoned it. She did work on it a little bit, but essentially the book was created in the year and a half after Charles M. Russell's death in October 1926.
Brian, the next question is also for you. What do we know about the manuscripts after Nancy's passing?
When Nancy Russell died in 1940, her estate was handled by a law firm that disposed of a certain amount of material that we would dearly love to have had saved. But we're fortunate in that most of what she wanted to save, business correspondence, drafts of her manuscript, and many, many other Charles M. Russell items were still preserved in her essentially estate collection. And that collection was acquired along with Nancy Russell's house by a consortium of businessmen, including Homer E. Britzman, who acquired the house and its contents, and that meant Nancy Russell's papers. No one got to work with them between the period of 1940, Nancy's death, and 1948, when Homer Britzman collaborated on a biography with the established writer Raymond Adams. He had limited access through Homer Britzman to the Nancy Russell estate papers. When Homer Britzman died, the papers passed on to his widow, and she, in effect, was their custodian, and no one got to work with them. In fact, she eventually, of course, died, and the papers were given to the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. They were in storage there from the time of Helen Britzman's death in the 1950s, right until 1990, with very limited access to them. So scholars didn't know what was really in them until Rick Stewart at the Amon Carter Museum got permission to access the collection for a few Amon Carter books on Russell's letters, sculpture, etc. And indeed, Amon Carter housed the collection for a few years. It was when it was with Amon Carter that I got involved with it and realized this was an absolute treasure trove, including drafts of Nancy's would-be biography, unfinished, in many different forms, notes to what she wanted to cover, pages of the manuscript, but it wasn't a book as such. It was a large number of pages that hadn't all been brought together. So as a consequence, it was one of many treasures to read and look at in the estate paper collection, which subsequently was acquired by the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And now it is widely available to any scholar interested in Russell's life. But no one has ventured to attempt to put together Nancy's biography because the materials in the collection are quite incomplete.
So it sounds like this work of Nancy's has been on quite a journey already. And Tom, I would ask you the question, how did you encounter this project?
Well, one day Peter Hasrick called me, and he was at that time the executive director of the Petrie Institute at the Denver Art Museum. And he said, Tom, he said, there's someone down in Colorado Springs that has some Russell materials, some memorabilia and some furniture and other personal items. Why don't you go down and see whether any of that would fit with your collection? And so I followed up and met this individual. He was a pastor and he was about to retire from his church. And he had received from this friend of his who had married Homer Brinsman's widow. And after she died, he inherited the furniture, some of the furniture that was in the house in Great Falls, and then went down to California when Nancy moved there shortly after Charlie's death. And that contents of the house that Homer Brinsman acquired was then transferred to Colorado Springs, where Homer had his base of operations. He had some oil fields and so on in California, but most of his time was spent in Colorado Springs. So I met the person, saw the furniture, saw some of the personal items, and was told about this manuscript. And so I acquired it later. The individual was pretty proud of it, and so I suggested to him that he might want to check with a number of the museums that were interested in Russell material. I told him what I was willing to pay for it, but I knew it was going to be disappointing to him. So I suggested that he take his time and visit some of the institutions that have already been mentioned here, and some others that would have an interest in Russell. And about a year later, his son called me and said, I've recommended to my dad that he take the proposal you've made. And I said, great, I'll give him a call and follow up. The furniture, I managed to arrange for the furniture to be picked up, and that was given to the Russell Museum back in 2011 or 12. And then there were some personal items which we acquired, one of which is a fur throw, and that ties back into the story we'll talk about today, since that's now also at the Russell Museum, and there's quite a little story as to how it came to be. And then there was the document, and that document was typewritten. It was a carbon copy type pages. So I contacted the Gilcrease at that time to say I had acquired this, and I wondered if there were other copies of this document. And they did quite a bit of checking, came back to me after several weeks of looking and said, we don't know of a document like what you've described that is together as a single document assembled the way you've described it. There are things that are spoken to there that we think do have, that are part of the Brinsman files, but not in the form that you have it. And so having acquired it, I had a sense that it might be interesting. And so, but I was as motivated to buy the furniture, frankly, and the fur throw and so on, because I thought these would all be good items for the museum, which was in the process of beginning to contemplate the kind of upgrade to the home and studio that we've now accomplished. And then I knew that I needed some more time to really think about what to do with it. And so for about 6 years, from 2011 to about 2015 or 16, something like that, I would read the document once or twice a year, read it all the way through, and just reflect on it. And after the second reading, I'd say it began to occur to me that, gee, there's some things in here that really cast new insights about the germ of the idea for certain paintings that Charlie did, and other insights. So then I reached out to both to Rick Stewart and to Brian Dippie on occasions when I was down, we were together down in Fort Worth, and I asked them to take a look at it and tell me whether they thought there was something incremental here from a scholarship standpoint. Both were affirmative on that, and I began working then for about 4 years, working on the idea of how to leave the manuscript largely intact, because they're Nancy's firsthand memories and articulations of their time together, which Brian has described beautifully in his essay in this book, that they had spent half of Charlie's life together married, and that between that and what Nancy had learned from Charlie's reminiscences that he would share with her personally and from other members of the Russell family, that this was an important manuscript to see if it couldn't be made available more broadly. And I worked on that for several years. It was really the better part of 4 years, where I had the idea that if we could use today's technology and the benefit of decades of Russell scholarship, combined with the images, there would be an ability to, if you will, deepen the appreciation of what Nancy had to say, but not do it in a way that would distract from or if you will, somehow marginalize her story. And I got to a point just a little less than a year ago where I realized I'd gone about as far as I could. And so I reached out to Brian again and said, Brian, I really think I've taken it about as far as I can, but I know it'll be a far better document if I can entice you to bring your perspectives to bear. And one of the biggest adventures of my 25 years of collecting Russell began at that point last June, when I called and Donna said to me, well, he's having a lot of fun with what you sent. And from there on, it's been a great collaboration where Brian could see holes in it, and I'll let him speak to that. There were some holes in the document. There was it began too abruptly. And he answered that question when I called him about after he had it for about a month, and he said, you know, the first chapter, it's not there. And I'll let him tell you that story, but it was really good because he said, but I have it. And he said, and it fits in just right. And then he said, there's another hole in the middle of it where the story of how Nancy meets Charlie is not in there, but it's clear that she really would want that to be in there and probably intended it to be there because she did articulate it well in another source, which he also had. And then he said, and by the way, I know you came up with a good title, but it wasn't the title she had. And I'll wrap up on that. I had used one of his expressions and I put a title on it because it was not a title on the manuscript. It was well assembled as I had it, but it did not have a title. And so I put Bushwhacked by Cupid, which was, of course, Charlie's articulation to his family when he told them that he was about to marry Nancy Cooper. And she did bushwhack him. There's no doubt about it, as he's the first to admit in this document and in various other places. But Brian said, no, I know what the title is, and that it's that backtracking in memory that we now have restored to this document.
Brian and Tom, both of you have dedicated a tremendous amount of energy and big portions of your life to celebrating Charlie, his work, and his legacy. Just walk us through, if you would. So this is a question for both of you. What was your reaction the first time that you read Nancy's words? Brian, we'll start with you.
Well, Tom has told a wonderful story about acquiring the manuscript, and when he showed it to me in Fort Worth, I made notes at the time on several of the chapters that I had never seen in the Nancy Russell estate papers. There were some overlapping chapters in manuscript in now the Gilcrease collection and in Tom's manuscript, but it had chapters on, for example, the Russells' only trip abroad in 1914 to London, basically, and then a short side trip to Paris. I had never seen any of that material, and it's wonderful. There's such a gap in the Russell story related to their experiences abroad and Charlie's deep, deep desire to get back home to Montana. Paris couldn't bring him. Rome, well, Paris brought him, but he couldn't wait to leave. And Rome was another matter. He had no intention of going there. He wanted to head due west back home. On the other hand, he enjoyed his time in Great Britain. He learned when he was there. And here were chapters about that experience that indeed filled in a vast gap in the Russell story, told as only Nancy could, because she has some wonderful tales about her experiences abroad. There was also a short chapter that confirmed an actual meeting in 1919 in Saskatoon between the Russells and the Prince of Wales, the touring future King of England. They met him at a formal ceremony in Saskatoon, and Nancy's account is delightful because the Russells, being good Americans, breached royal protocol and reached out to shake his hand. And as a consequence, Nancy's story was completely unknown, verified an actual meeting with the prince before he inspected a Russell exhibition that had been really arranged in Saskatoon for the prince to see. All that material was brand new, and the typescript that Tom had acquired. And we kept thinking, well, gosh, or I kept thinking, if we could wed what I had seen before in the manuscript material with what Tom has here, we would have a book. Now, Nancy never finished the book, and I want to emphasize that there is a quality in even her typescript manuscript where you can feel her piling together the stuff she wanted to get to. And then there are notes in her manuscript materials that we have included in this edition as an appendix that tell you about all the topics she still hoped to get to. Some of them she did. They could have been crossed off, but several she didn't. And they are extremely important as an insight into what the full finished biography in her mind would have it contained. So we realized, I tried with Tom's kind invitation to join him in this great venture, we realized we could wed manuscript material, including the opening chapter Tom mentioned, and even a brief foreword that gave the title to the book and is a wonderful setup for what follows. Nancy's role, in effect, in Charlie Russell's life is outlined in a couple of paragraphs and a foreword that wasn't part of the typescript. So title, foreword, and opening chapter could be added to what Tom had. And then, as Tom mentioned, a critical chapter, Charlie and Nancy's first meeting, was not in the typescript, and I know exactly why. Nancy lifted the chapter out of the manuscript as she had worked along out of her manuscript materials, lifted it out, and in effect pillaged it to write a short biographical note at the front of Good Medicine. She never restored that chapter to her manuscript, but we could, utilizing what we knew from the estate papers. There were other materials, minor, but basically the notes towards what she meant to cover, that along with Tom's typescript, we think adds up to a really exciting book for Russell fans. It'll give Nancy's perspective on Charlie, and as she understood his early years in Montana, through again Charlie's stories and the stories of friends and family. And then once they meet in 1895, thereafter it becomes a biographical memoir. She still incorporates material from friends, a letter from Bill Hart, the cowboy movie star in the early days of the silent Western, and other friends who could tell stories about Charlie. But we think we have here, I know we do, an entirely original and fascinating work that I believe will delight readers who will find Nancy's voice, in fact, a welcome addition to their whole understanding of the Charlie Russell story.
Tom, the same question to you. Just walk us through your first reaction when reading the typescript.
Well, one of the things that really hit me very early on was that I was reading something that really gave me insight into how Charlie's time as a cowboy gave him a series of germs of ideas for great paintings. And one of the most exciting times in that first pass through was a tale that Nancy told of Charlie in the Judith Basin. And he had just been hired under somewhat dubious circumstances, since he'd been fired for not taking good care of sheep. But he was returning from a trip to St. Louis and ran into a trail drive, and they had just fired a Nighthawk, and he was put on as the Nighthawk, the person who take care of the herd at night. And there's an amusing tale about that, but also he then began 11 years as the Nighthawk. And one of the stories that Nancy told became clear to me was the germ of the idea for the painting, The Horse Thieves. This is a beautiful nocturne painted by Charlie in 1901, but really looking back on his days in the Judith Basin as a teenager still, when he was there, and Nancy talks about the trail of the Blackfoot Indians going through the Judith Basin down to the Crow reservation where Indians like White Quiver, the legendary horse thief of the Blackfoot, would steal horses and then come back through. And Charlie had an incident one night where he saw that actually happening. And the clue that this was the germ of the idea is when he described it to Nancy, he said there was a full moon rising. And that full moon that was shining became the clue. And when you look at the horse thieves and the Indians coming through, it's pretty clear cut. Years and years later, decades later, Fred Renner put the story back together in his book on Russell that was done by Eamon Carter, and identified in the painting White Quiver, the legendary horse thief, and Charlie's horse, Monty, is following right behind the horse that Charlie traded for when he settled in with Jake Hoover. So it really was a closing up of a story that's part of the Charlie Russell legend. As I proceeded through the balance of it, I found several other cases. Muscle Shell Roundup story ties into that very similarly. And also, the other thing that really got me excited was there's enough about Will Rogers, about W.S. Hart, and about other relationships like Con Price. There are amusing stories. They really, there are times when I found myself just laughing out loud over the stories that had to be told. Brian mentioned the W.S. Hart letter that Nancy asked Hart to write. Hart remembered back 20 years to their time together in New York. And there's a great amusing tale. I call it the Shootout on 42nd Street, right at the location today of the New York Public Library. And Hart's remembering it. And it was a whole bunch of people who were shooting not to kill. It was probably a labor dispute. It took a decade to build that New York Public Library. It covers a whole city block now. And it took down some of the places that Charlie and Nancy were in, the studios of some of the artists and so on. So the shootout on 42nd Street, Charlie goes home after that 6 weeks or so in New York and paints the gunfighters, a painting that's now owned. It's in my collection, but half of it's owned by the Russell Museum already under a gift that my wife and I have made. And you can't help but wonder how that experience with the shootout on 42nd Street might have motivated Charlie to talk a little differently about the shootouts that he knew about in Montana. So those are the kinds of things that really come through in this. It's like a lot of the things on Russell. It's a jigsaw puzzle, and if you can locate the pieces of the puzzle and find out which ones fit together over time, if you're patient, it's like one of the most exciting jigsaws you can put together.
I know that Brian has touched on this a bit, but readers will recognize that there is a unique and intentional structure to this book with the sidebars, a prefatory note, and Nancy's note at the end, Nancy's notes at the end. And Tom, I would ask you, can you elaborate on what the intent behind that approach was and what you hope readers will gain from these unique features?
This is one of those areas that I was working toward before I reached out to Brian, and I was feeling my way. I wanted something that would add additional texture to the overall story. But really, this really became well-defined in the first 2 or 3 months after Brian was involved, because we were both dedicated to not having it distract from the flow of Nancy's story. And I had described it when I sent it to Brian. I said, look, I've really lightly edited, only in cases where adding a word or two might nail down the meaning of a sentence, but not a case and always identifying any ads like that with square brackets so that anybody reading it can see that really these are Nancy's words. This is something she was dedicated to for at least 12 years. And other things that she mentions, she talks about about the present war and contrasts it with World War I. So we know she's working on it in the first 4 and 5 months of 1940. She dies on May 24th of 1940, and she basically, at that point, is still working on it. So I can picture her as very frustrated by that. So my desire relative to your question was to add texture where, because of scholarship by many Russell scholars, among the most eminent Brian and Rick Stewart together, and many others that have brought things to bear, we could add some texture to what she had to say, but we needed to do it where it was clearly identified on a different colored paper and in a manner where it's additive but not distractive. And that was really the goal. Brian really picked up on that, and I don't think we've had a conversation since last June where we haven't reiterated our commitment to that, such that one can read it through. One could take this book and read it through, just reading it, and then on a second pass, divert, or you can read it and divert and take it in installments or whatever. But the point is not to have the sidebars or the images distract. But in some cases, when she talks about a trip that they made out to the Flathead Reservation to look at buffalo, as Charlie in 1919, as Charlie was painting Buffalo Hunt number 39 and Buffalo Hunt number 40, you learn something about what he wanted to do. He wanted to see, with that photographic mind, he wanted to see those buffalo moving. And he goes up to them and he studies them for a while and takes in those images, takes his hat off and starts waving his hat and really pushing the buffalo to move, to capture the action that he shows in the last two, and I would say among the very greatest of his buffalo hunt scenes. And so we're able to add that context there and really make the image that Nancy's talking about with her own good memory come alive for the reader.
And Brian, this next question, actually this break kind of comes at a timely spot. I was going to ask again about the first chapter, the missing first chapter, and you'd already mentioned that Nancy lifted it, and used it elsewhere, but never put it back. So I might just kind of rephrase the question and just say, can you give us a sense of the process of reconciling the missing first chapter with the typescript?
It wasn't the first chapter in the manuscript that Nancy, I keep saying pillaged or pirated. It was her writing, so she had a right to it, but she plucked it out of what she had been working on for the book. It was about a middle chapter, and that would be the account of first meeting with Charlie.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But she had a first chapter as well. It was kind of a background history. Critical, Tom felt, once I was able to send him a copy of it, to setting up the book. It had just started with what now is chapter 2, and it didn't have a foreword or this introductory chapter talking a little bit about his family. There were these odd holes in the manuscript where Nancy had completed the chapter, but hadn't kept it with the manuscript that Tom acquired. Okay. Just as there were chapters in Tom's manuscript that aren't in the Nancy Russell papers. Presumably, there would have been a draft at some point, but they were gone. And so his manuscript had material that no one had seen before. wedding these two, marrying. The material from Nancy Russell's estate papers and Tom's manuscript provides a fuller version of what she had already accomplished. And as Tom pointed out, and this is critical, we have tried to allow the reader to simply read Nancy's manuscript as she wrote it. Throughout our book, there is no footnoting to her accounts and no corrections. There are insertions or additions occasionally for clarity only, but otherwise every word that Nancy put in her typescript that Tom owned is in this book exactly as she wrote it. And the chapters from her estate papers are not in any way altered. Occasionally a piece, twice I think, got moved from one chapter to another, and we have indicated it in the publication by extra space between the sections. But these are all Nancy's words. They were all part of her project. And I give an example. Tom's collection has provided some excellent images, and then many other institutions and private owners have provided more. These constitute the sidebar commentaries that are distinct from Nancy's text, but totally complementary, we believe, to what she was covering and discussing at any given point. Remember that I mentioned she wanted always to have a biography that would also showcase Charlie's art. And the sidebars, along with a few family photos, are in fact devoted to Charlie's art in order to realize what Nancy herself wanted the book to contain. So I think the book as put forward, on the one hand, a reader can just read Nancy's text going through the book, and then, as Tom suggested, the reader can add the sidebars, or maybe at the moment you read the text, you have a question and the sidebar illustrations and commentaries are meant to amplify. But it's not a footnoted scholarly work that overrides Nancy in any way. It's her story, her backtracking in memory, the life of Charles M. Russell, artist.
One of the thoughts I have, sorry, go ahead.
Well, actually, Tom, I was just going to follow that up with a question to you about the title, Backtracking in Memory, is very specific. Can you tell us more about how that title emerged?
Well, Brian knew it, that she wanted to use it. And I was more than willing to, I'd been kind of reaching for a title when I came up with a Bushwhacked by Cupid. And we developed that part of the story in the text. So it was not a problem when he said, this is what she really wanted. Brian knows more than I do, but what I will say is that Charlie had used that backtracking kind of notion in some of the other books earlier, and it was just a common term that was of that era that he was dealing with, and it's also a term that Indians used for their when they were talking about their trails through the West. So I think all of that fits in. And Nancy, more than anything, I think Nancy was realizing what a memory she had. Brian can cite it far better than I can, but we have in there the quote from somebody who knew Nancy in Helena when she was 16, 17 years old before she moved to Cascade, and wrote to Nancy much later, "Are you the same person I knew back then?" And she said she was. And she said, "I'm married to the only Charlie Russell." And then she goes on to say, "I lived a life that was," this is loose paraphrasing. I'll let Brian clean it up for me. But she says, "I lived a life that was more like one that from Hollywood, only mine was real." Mm-hmm. And it really captures it. One thing I wanted to say, one of the most important things that really got me excited when Brian and I started working together is he came up with several things in the front of the book that really set the stage. And one was what we already talked about, Nancy's succinct 2-paragraph description. 1 paragraph about who Charlie was and wasn't, and who she was and what she was going to do. And I mean, it was explicit, but really informative. And so with those ground rules established in literally an opening page, you know then how to navigate the tale she's going to tell. But the other part that Brian came up with, it because of all the work he'd done on Word Painter, and I think I had forgotten about the great letter. I'd seen it before, but I hadn't made the connection. And that letter where Charlie is with his cousins and his siblings on his grandfather's farm outside of St. Louis. And his brother Bent is out there with a musket and firing it. And Charlie's coming along as the younger male in the group, and is insisting he wants it. And Bent says, "All right." And then he packs an extra heavy load. Charlie climbs up on a fence and is blown off by the kick of the gun. And with that, you're transposed into the boyhood experiences of the Russell children. And I had some great experiences personally in northern Vermont with my 2 brothers. And I had a grandmother who, time and again, when I read about Nancy, I'm reminded of my grandmother. They had similar upbringing, and both of them were, they'd been born in the 19th century, but in many respects, they were 21st century women where males with big titles did not intimidate them. And you see all of that in this book. And very early on, you see that. And when you have that kind of a picture in mind, it becomes an adventure to go from chapter to chapter to chapter, seeing the juxtaposition of these images that so often helped Nancy create a certain degree of focus. And then in the case of our having the benefit of what came out of the catalog raisonné, what came out of the many exhibitions that have been done, the ability to find those same images and place them in a way where that diversion becomes a very uplifting in that process of reading a book as brief as this book is. It becomes, an important an important adjunct to Nancy's story.
Brian, as you noted in your prefatory note, this is not a book on Nancy. It's a book on Charlie, but it's her voice that's the most important to come out. What do you feel readers will recognize as being the most revealing aspect about Nancy?
This book, I want to throw a quick tribute to one of Tom's ideas early on. The title that I wanted to use was Nancy's title. Tom hadn't seen it before, but it was Tom who pointed out, well, that then completes the trilogy. Nancy and Charlie, because he was still alive when she started it, created the collection of his stories, Trails Plowed Under. Nancy fought for that title, and then when she turned to a letters book, a collection of Charlie's illustrated letters, she fought for the title for that one too, a favorite expression of Charlie's. Something is good medicine in a very broad sense, even a spiritual sense. And Nancy wanted good medicine, that phrase, to be her title. Well, in this book, early on, she had titled it Backtracking in Memory, so that we have a trilogy, Trails Plowed Under, Good Medicine, and now Backtracking in Memory, all titles that Nancy chose and would have fought for. And I think that that is one element of the book that we want to go ahead and bring forward. This was her dream. It's her voice telling stories that we hadn't heard before from her perspective. There's a wonderful account in the chapter on going to Paris about how Nancy was wounded by the shop girls who were mocking her. She felt in a language she couldn't understand, but they were looking over and smirking at her because she was wearing clothing that wasn't really up to date in Paris. Nancy's account of her own personal sense at times of being with Charlie is really important, but there are also anecdotes that give you an insight into her own sensitivity. She'd grown up poor. She had achieved great things by managing Russell's business career. And at the same time, she was still vulnerable to that sense of being looked down on. And that chapter is one of the revelatory chapters about Nancy as a person. She wanted the book to be about Charlie, and she wanted him recognized not simply as a Western artist or a cowboy artist. She wanted to say, as she did in her subtitle, The Life of Charles M. Russell, artist. And that was important to her. They might not be everything the sophisticated world admired, but they had made their way and made it fabulously. I really enjoy that aspect of getting to know Nancy better through her manuscript. After especially she has met Charlie. Obviously the stories she tells thereafter involve her as well. Her personality is a constant thread in her account of Charlie Russell's career.
You know, and I pick up on that, if I might, for a minute, Tom. And I mentioned the fur and the fur throw that is now at the museum. And it came along with the manuscript. But in that letter that W.S. Hart wrote to Nancy, he's saying to her, and this is 1929, I think he's written this note, and it's tied to a 1904 incident in New York where Nancy Hart had brought in somebody who he knew who wanted to own a Russell. And Hart and Russell are there. And they'd talked about, well, should we ask $100 or $150 for this painting if he asked? And Nancy apparently had shown up just as the guy was looking at it and he said, how much do you want? Charlie looked at her and she looked at Charlie with that, and this is not in there, but you can tell the look she gave him was, I'll take care of this. and she quickly says, $400. And there was a hesitance, and the guy looked at the painting, and then he looked back at them and said, I'll take it. And she then describes Charlie as almost fainting and really shocked that he was way underpricing it. And after the guy leaves, they go to dinner, and Charlie, and then Hart in this letter, over 2 decades later, is saying, Charlie wanted you to have it all. And I really think the interpretation that is there is she got $300, the overage, if you will, and she went out and bought a fur coat because in Great Falls, Montana, the winters, a fur coat would be nice to have. And we do have photos of her in that fur coat. After Charlie died, and she moved 2 months later, I believe, to California, I think she took the fur coat with her and had it trimmed down to be a fur throw, much more suitable for her new home. And Rick told me one time, Rick Stewart told me that he remembered somewhere in those Brinsman files something about the cutting down of a fur coat to a fur throw. I've yet to find that, so I can't be totally sure, but Rick Stewart has a pretty good memory. So I've gone back to him and he said, yeah, you should be able to find it somewhere there. That's on my to-do list before I completely stop doing these things.
I don't know if I'm on, but I would mention that the letter Tom was describing earlier of Charlie firing the musket and getting blown back by his big brother saying, okay, kid, go for it. That letter is the famous letter to Albert Trigg, which is a critical part of your collection to me, because I saw that on display on my first visit to what we called the Trigg Russell Museum, which is now, of course, the C.M. Russell Museum. But that letter is in the collection in Great Falls. And it is a wonderful example of Charlie's own autobiographical renderings in his letters of incidents in his life, getting punished at school, various things. When you look at the letters, you get an idea of how Charlie looked back on his childhood. And the family, of course, reminisced fondly about what a scamp he was. He enjoyed all that a great deal, and this book captures it because we're able to put in these sidebar illustrations that are relevant to stories Nancy has heard and retells in her own manuscript.
That letter is pretty special. That's a unique part of our collection. And yes, we were lucky to have it for sure. Yes, and I would just kind of ask a similar question to you, Tom, about what do you feel the manuscript does in terms of providing a perspective on Russell, but also on Charlie and Nancy's lives together? What do you think is a unique thing about that readers may expect?
You know, I think Nancy could be very tough. And so there has, after Charlie died, there's a body of work that talked about the enemies she made. And there's no question but what there were times where the marriage had their moments. But what you find is that Charlie was never confused about the value that she added to what I call the Russell art enterprise, and he was proud of the role she played in making sure that he was recognized for the quality of his work, for the messages there, for the humor. And so on. So I really think this fills out quite a bit on that. And, you know, one of the struggles I was having right around the time I was ready to approach Brian to help me with this, I was really struggling with how do you end it? Because as Brian has correctly said, the manuscript does not come to a conclusion by itself. But fortuitously, I came across something that Jack Barfield had, and it was a painting that had been done by Joe Shirley, who lived in South Orange, New Jersey, and it was 6 years after Charlie died that this painting was done, And it was on March 19th when a number of well-to-do people in New York, in the New York area, both in Manhattan and New Jersey and so on, came together to celebrate the birthday of Charlie Russell. And Joe Shirley had a very nice likeness of Charles Russell, the spirit of Charles Russell rising over Manhattan. And it gave me an idea that with a little bit of commentary, I could bring this to something of a conclusion. And then when Brian came in, his afterword really was precious, and his knowledge of other things that Nancy had said, and the tribute that Charlie paid to Nancy at the end of this book speaks volumes about that relationship. Yes, there were times when Nancy would have a real temper tantrum, and we see it right at the beginning of the book when they've just moved from Cascade. After they met, not at the very beginning of the book, but at the beginning of their relationship, they moved from Cascade to Great Falls, and a friend of Charlie's arranges a dinner at one of the hotels, and the arrangement they had 100 guests, and Charlie painted watercolor menus for each of the guests, each one differentiated, and got the sum total of 16 cents for each and every one of those items. And Nancy said, right there, we had a real fuss. And he was periodically then subjected to those fusses a number of times. One time when his good friend Con Price, who was famous for his horses, there was what could have been a really bad ride, could have been a fatal ride if things hadn't turned out differently, for Philip R. Goodwin, when they went over to when Charlie and Nancy and Goodwin went over to see Con Price. Nancy had a big to-do then. It was written about another decade plus later by Con Price in his book. But that relationship, Charlie really summed it up well, and Brian built that into that conclusion. So number one was to be able to talk a little bit about how almost spontaneously collectors of Russell were drawn to celebrate the artist's birthday 6 years after he had passed. We still celebrate it since 1969 at the Russell auction, and we'll be celebrating it next week at the sealed bid auction this year. But we've been celebrating it for more than 50 years as an extension of that spontaneous recognition of how unique he was. Nancy considered him one of the greatest souls the country has ever known, and Will Rogers agreed with her. And so that's and he, even though she could be difficult and sometimes embarrassing when she let her temper get ahead of her, and he knew how to deal with it. He describes it so nicely in a few words about when the temper flared, he'd put his hat on, he'd go out the door, walk on down to one of the bars in downtown, come back later whistling, and he'd come in the back step, and the clouds had cleared and everything was fine. So the relationship was a powerful one. It was deep, and to me, she epitomizes the transformation of the role of men and women and their relationships as we've morphed from the 19th century through the 20th century, and indeed today in the 21st century with a redefinition of that male-female relationship.
Well, Tom and Brian, a closing question for you both, and Brian, we'll start with you. What about this book and this project has inspired you most?
This book offers material that we haven't seen before on episodes and incidents in Charles M. Russell's career and life. But I think the most important thing is realizing a vision Nancy carried in her head. When she hired Dan Conway, the Great Falls journalist, to prepare a biography of Charlie, she made it clear from the outset. I was just looking at the title page of the manuscript Dan Conway prepared. He called his book A Child of the Frontier, but on the title page is this statement: written under the direction of and in cooperation with Nancy C. Russell. Now, she demanded that that appear in effect. And it meant that she always had in mind, if it didn't work with someone else, she would in fact launch into the project herself. And I love the fact that she spent so much time on the book, but set it aside for a different book that now we would never want to be without: Good Medicine, the first collection of Charlie Russell's letters. I think this amplifies the story, and I very much agree with remarks Tom made about Nancy's role. And I'll just tell you one anecdote in the book that I think is critical. Is right after Charlie accepted this incredibly insultingly low payment for all those original menus for a banquet in Great Falls, Nancy tells the story of a painting he had just completed of a herd of buffalo crossing the river and blocking the passage of a steamboat. She says it was a beautiful painting, and there was a woman in Great Falls who was interested in acquiring it. And off she went with Charlie initially to sell it to her. But the key was, what price would she name? And Charlie warned her, don't name too high a price. We need the money. Don't turn this woman away. But Nancy, in fact, increased the asking price by 10 extra dollars, all the way to $150 or some figure. I'm trying to remember it. Tom will. But the key is
35 up from 25.
there. Well, the key is, she says, we had horses to feed and I needed a new cook stove. Glory be. The woman paid it without a blink. She just wrote the check, and now I had $10 towards that cook stove. You gotta love Nancy's moxie.
That's right. And then she added one more thing. She said, you know, Charlie was, somehow she tied it to the largest commission she ever got, which is the $30,000 from Mr. Doheny, the California oil man, for the murals. And she said, and when, you know, he was as pleased with that 35 that I got instead of 25 as he was when I showed him a check for $30,000. And he said, and supposedly he said, I can't read that many zeros. How many are there?
Tom, similar question to you. As you've worked on this book, and now we're at the phase where it's going into publication. What inspires you most from this?
Well, it's one of those things. If you stay curious about a great American story, you just continue to be surprised at how things can show up, and if you've built a body of knowledge, or at least know the right people like Brian Dippie and Rick Stewart, you can figure out how that piece of the puzzle fits into another piece of the puzzle. And this is what this has done for me. It really has inspired me to stay alert, because I'm still continuing to be surprised at how items show up, and people treasured the output. Austin Russell once said, Charlie puts as much effort into things not meant to sell, but were little artistic creations that he had, as he did on masterworks. And people who have those sometimes pass them down time after time after time. As we were doing the Charles M. Russell, The Women in His Life and Art, and we were working on the paintings and that would be in there and so on, I got a call one day from a dealer who said, "I've got something you need to see." And it turned out to be three Russell items, one of which ended up being the cover of that exhibition that we did. The germ of the idea was Ginger Renner's article about Charles M. Russell, the women in his life. And I said, let's turn this into an exhibition and get, and drill down and give more depth to that and make it Charles M. Russell, the women in his life and art. And we did, but then the cover for that came to me from a family. They were good friends of Charlie and Nancy. They lived in Denver, but they had a summer home in Whitefish, Montana, and they owned 3 Russell paintings, 2 of which they bought directly from Charlie and Nancy, one of which they bought their children bought at an auction, maybe 30 years ago. And so I found myself inspired to continue the quest, because the trail of Charles Russell is a special trail, and he left a lot of sign along the way to those who want to pick it up and figure out how it fits in with other pieces of this puzzle. My wife's a big puzzler, and she has an office next to mine at home, and she's been puzzling a lot lately. And I really, I view some of what I've been able to do as a collector is figuring out puzzle pieces that have been scattered, but deserve to be brought back together to see what when you reassemble them, what they mean. I couldn't do it without the assistance of people who've dedicated their entire professional lives to this. And my collaborator on this one epitomizes that, as does his dear friend, Rick Stewart, and as does Larry Peterson, our upcoming chairman of the board at the Russell Museum. Dear friends, it was Larry Peterson who told me I could not afford to leave the Coeur d'Alene auction without buying the holdup when it came up. And he was right, even though I left with a lot less liquid cash. Enough of that. You can edit out any of that you want.
Well, Tom and Brian, thank you again for your tremendous work and commitment to the legacy of Charlie and Nancy. I think Brenda and I, and anybody watching can say the Russell world is richer thanks to your work. So thank you both.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you both so much.
Thanks.
A lot of fun.
The Russell Museum is a proud collaborator of this remarkable book, Backtracking in Memory, The Life of Charles M. Russell, Artist. Much like the Russell Home and Studio located on our campus, this publication provides a personal and dynamic look at a transformative Western couple, Charlie and Nancy. We also thank Far Country Press and all other key supporters who have provided reproduction rights to images and artwork. Pre-orders for Backtracking in Memory are available now by visiting cmrussell.org or by calling the number that you see on the screen. Books will be available in late spring 2021. We once again salute our sponsor for all education programming at the CM Russell Museum, D.A. Davidson Companies. Thank you. And thank you to each of you for joining us for the 2021 Educational Symposium. Be well.